right, well, now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who has been stationed at the Oberlin Heritage Center for the last year as the Region 3 Ohio History Service Corps, or AmeriCorps, member. Marissa Hamm is from Strongsville, Ohio, and she graduated from the College of Worcester in 2019 with a degree in history and anthropology. After graduating, she served as a Cole Fellow for a year at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site in Catskill, New York. There, she conducted research on the Cole family and the transformation of the historic site from a home to a museum. Marissa serves on the Board of Trustees for the Wayne County Historical Society in Worcester, and she helps lead video production for the organization. Marissa has seen OHC and her regional outreach sites through quite an interesting year by engaging the public through largely digital means, including social media, online exhibitions, and the HistoryForge platform, which you will all hear about shortly. We are delighted to say that Marissa will begin her pursuit of a museum studies master's degree at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis in just a couple of weeks. And while there, she will also be interning at the Indiana Medical History Museum. And as happy as we are for her to continue her studies and work in the field, we will also greatly miss her and her passion for history, as this Saturday is her last day at Oberlin. Marissa, thank you for all you have done in your time at OHC, and best wishes to you. And with that, I'll turn this over to you.
Great, thank you, Amanda. So as Amanda mentioned, my name is Marissa, and I have served as the Region 3 local history member in the Ohio History Service Corps for the past year, and my host site has been the Oberlin Heritage Center. So if you're unfamiliar with the AmeriCorps program, there we go. So the way that it operates, I spend half of my time with my host site and the other half with outreach sites. So for my host site, the Heritage Center, as Amanda mentioned, I assisted with managing social media, creating kiosks that you may have seen along Main Street this year, and also running HistoryForge as the project manager and other activities throughout this time. Then the other half of my time has been spent working with history organizations in Northeast Ohio. And these are just a few of the organizations that I worked with this year, and there were a few others as well. And the goal of this is to bring museum best practices in the form of the AASLH's STEPS program to these organizations and help them see through projects that they would like to do. So in my time in this position, HistoryForge was definitely the thing that I expected the least and enjoyed the most. So if you have been following the Heritage Center's social media or any of our outlets, you've probably heard the word HistoryForge many times, and you're either very curious or kind of tired of hearing about it. So tonight I'll be talking about what exactly HistoryForge is and giving you that information before I dive into what life was like in Oberlin in 1910. So what is HistoryForge? HistoryForge is an interactive database that maps information from censuses onto historical map layers. The HistoryForge project is based out of Ithaca, New York, through the History Center in Tompkins County, and it is generously supported by a 2-year grant for public engagement with historical records from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission of the National Archives. That's a mouthful, but essentially what this means is that the HistoryForge project is a software that maps historical census data onto historical map layers. And the reason that Oberlin is involved with this organization from Ithaca is because in November of 2020, the History Center reached out to us as a potential partner as they try to pilot the HistoryForge program to be used outside of just Ithaca. And Oberlin is currently the only town outside of the state of New York that is participating in this project, and hopefully this will be expanding to even more places outside of both Oberlin and New York State. So when we decided to participate in this project, one of the first questions we had to answer was what census year to begin with. So this question was fairly easy for us because our partners in Ithaca recommended starting with 1910, since that is a somewhat easier to start with census. It's very straightforward. So if you've never worked with census data before, this is a page from the 1910 census. And very simply, you had enumerators who had to take a test and then were chosen to be the people who would go door to door and gather this information from households. And the information they were gathering were obviously the street address and the names of the people living in that dwelling. And then they were gathering information like their gender, their race, age, marital status, language spoken, place of birth, occupation, and whether or not they owned or rented their home, and things of that nature. And that's what you'll see in this 1910 census here. And if you visit HistoryForge, this is the type of information you can see in your research. So once we figured out we were doing the 1910 census, the other big question was, did we actually have people who were interested in helping us with this project? Because without volunteers, it would not be possible. And luckily, Oberlin has a great group of volunteers who were open to trying this out with us. And one of the best parts about HistoryForge for us is that it came to us at a time when we weren't seeing a lot of volunteers. And for me personally, I hadn't met pretty much any of the volunteers that would normally be at Oberlin because of the pandemic. And HistoryForge can actually be run completely remotely on Zoom. So you can see this Zoom session we had here in the springtime. And the way that this works is that volunteers are paired together and one volunteer reads off the census information and then the other volunteer types it into HistoryForge. And this works pretty well. And we also have volunteers who will transcribe this information on their own outside of these group sessions. So not only has this allowed us to connect with volunteers in a safe way during the pandemic, but it has also allowed us to connect with volunteers who no longer live in Oberlin. So we have one volunteer who is now living in Alabama, and she's able to help us a great deal, and she doesn't have to be in Oberlin to do that, which is really great. So with all this help that we've had from our volunteers, our HistoryForge now has over 7,000 records entered. And this is really astounding considering we just started this project in January of 2021. We have the entire 1910 census transcribed and available online. And so if you visit HistoryForge, you'd be able to see all that data. And you'll start to see some of the 1940 census, which our volunteers are now 2/3 of the way through transcribing that as well. The other thing you'll be able to see in addition to the census information is 2 Sanborn map layers. So if you're unfamiliar with Sanborn maps, this visual you can see here to the right, and you'll see this throughout the presentation. This is actually a screenshot from HistoryForge, and that is a Sanborn map layer. So the Sanborn maps were created throughout the late 19th and 20th and early 20th centuries. And every 10 years or so, this fire insurance company would go around and create these maps for fire insurance purposes, of course, but for historians today, these maps are really great as this historical record that the Library of Congress has wonderfully digitized and made available online. And for HistoryForge, these maps are great because they show the actual buildings. So those red dots that you're seeing, those are the HistoryForge dots. And if you were to click on one of those, you would be able to see the street address and who was living in that home at that time period. So this is a great visual for us, and you'd be able to see 2 map layers so far on HistoryForge today. So with that little explanation of what HistoryForge is and where we're at currently, tonight I'll be talking about the context of 1910 and what life was like in Oberlin. And HistoryForge really inspired this project for me because seeing all this census data and seeing these names on a piece of paper, I found myself really wanting to have a better understanding of what these names, what their lives were actually like in Oberlin at this time period. So I'll go into that in great detail. And then I'll go into a discussion of how to actually use HistoryForge for either your research purposes or just for fun. And then I'll end briefly with a discussion of the future of Oberlin's HistoryForge, and I'll leave some time for questions as well. There we go. So what was life like in Oberlin in 1910? So if you'd like to take a moment to close your eyes if you'd like to, or you can just listen, I'd like to paint a picture of what the town was like for people in 1910. So Oberlin is still a small town, as Oberlinians have fought to keep large businesses and factories from the town. Houses are on large parcels of land with generous spacing and ample trees lining the tree lawn. Although there are still dirt roads around town and people riding in horses and buggies and on bicycles, many parts of the town now have paved streets and stone sidewalks. The first car passed through town in 1899, speeding by at the conservative speed limit of 8 miles per hour. You also have to watch as you cross the streets for the tracks of the electric rail and the emerald green trolley that rolls through and whisks Oberlinians away for day trips to Cleveland, Wellington, and beyond. Your day starts with an early morning grocery delivery and a perusal of the newspaper. You notice an interesting article about the state of divorce cases in the US and a new proclamation from Mayor Doolittle imploring all homeowners to eradicate weeds from their yards. If the day is particularly cold, your children run to the Oberlin Savings Bank to check and see if the Gators family skating rink is open. Or if it's a hot summer day, you sit out on the front porch and wish for the drought of that summer to end and for the 17-year cicadas to return to the ground. As a whole, your life in Oberlin is quite peaceful and similar to that of anyone in a small town in 1910 America. So now that you have a bit of a visual sense of what Oberlin was like in 1910, and these pictures here help as well, let me dive into what were the issues of the day? What were Oberlinians concerned about? What were they talking about and dealing with? So Oberlinians in 1910 were in the midst of the Progressive Era, which was a time of social activism and political reform across the United States. Citizens that followed these progressive ideals wanted to end corruption in government, improve factory working conditions, and overall improve the living conditions of people throughout the nation. There were a lot of different facets to the progressive movement, and Oberlinians were involved in many of them. So one of the first big movements of the progressive era was suffrage. So if you've been paying attention to any history presentations in the past 2 years with the suffrage centennial, then you'll know that Oberlin was definitely involved in the suffrage movement. And in 1910 in particular, Oberlin hosted the state branch of the Federation of Women's Clubs at Oberlin campus. And they thought this was a great place to host this type of meeting because Oberlin was founded on these ideals of equality. So why not talk about women's equality at a place like Oberlin? Another big issue of the progressive era was temperance. And Oberlinians were also, of course, involved in that. So if you're familiar with Oberlin's history, Oberlin was a dry town and it remained so until 1970. So in 1910, it was still a dry town. And this, however, did not prevent the evils of alcohol from infiltrating Oberlin from the surrounding towns. So I include this article here from the newspaper in 1910 that states, Illyria booze was responsible. So not only does this demonstrate how alcohol incidents did happen in Oberlin, even though alcohol was not sold in Oberlin, but this also shows how temperance and a lot of different facets of the progressive era perpetuated racism. And so we see this here in this article, and I'll continue to talk about examples of this in Oberlin in 1910 throughout this presentation. So in addition to Oberlin being a dry town, Oberlinians also founded the Ohio Anti-Saloon League in 1893. And the idea behind this organization was that if you closed down saloons, then people wouldn't have anywhere to go to get alcohol, and therefore it would eradicate alcohol consumption. And so Oberlinians were definitely passionate about this idea that alcohol could create more social ills. And this was a belief that some people held without a lot of evidence that the consumption of alcohol exacerbated issues of poverty, and even in some cases, people believed insanity. So one facet of the progressive era that Oberlinians were not particularly involved in was the issues of factory working conditions. And this was largely because of the fact that Oberlin, as I've mentioned, did not have large factories in its town. It was a fairly small town with about 4,300 people. Another part of this was child labor. And again, Oberlin didn't have as much of an issue with this because they had such high rates of students being still in school. So according to the 1910 census and HistoryForge, there were 952 children between the ages of 5 and 18 in Oberlin at this time. And of those children, 816 of them were still in school, which is 86% of that group. So there were so many students actually still enrolled in school at this time that in the fall of 1910, the town had to propose a $15,000 bond in order to add 4 classrooms to the Prospect School in order to accommodate all of these students and keep the teacher to student ratio low enough that they could maintain this standard of excellence in their schooling in town. So perhaps the progressive era movement that most affected Oberlin and how it looked, and people were really involved in this, was City Beautiful. So if you're not familiar with the City Beautiful movement, this was a reaction to the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and it swept across the nation throughout the early 20th century. So the idea behind this was that factory jobs that were replacing agricultural work were causing people to swarm to cities. And then these urban areas became very overcrowded, and this caused a lot of unrest, violence, and disease. And so one person, Frederick Law Olmsted, who I'm sure you recognize his name, he was an urban designer, and he believed that the solution to this problem of overpopulation in urban areas was to have a strategic redesigning of the city. And this is where the City Beautiful movement comes from. So followers of City Beautiful aim to create spacious, beautiful cities with these impressive public buildings, modern sewage systems, and expansive public transportation. The goal here was to improve the morality of citizens and by making their town or their city beautiful, that they would want to upkeep this city the way that they had created it. So Cleveland was a participant in the City Beautiful movement, and you can see a photograph here of what was called the Group Plan of 1903. And if you've been to Cleveland, then you'll recognize some of the aspects of this movement that was, or this plan that was enacted at this time period. In particular, there's still the courthouse building, and then that long stretch there that had fountains. Today, the fountains are gone, but you'll still see that large green space over the convention center there. So Oberlin also had a City Beautiful movement. However, it was at a much scaled down version, just due to the fact that Oberlin was significantly smaller than Cleveland. So City Beautiful came to Oberlin in the form of the Oberlin Village Improvement Society, which I will refer to as Opus. So Opus was founded in 1903, and their goal was to make Oberlin more beautiful, healthful, and moral. Interestingly, Opus was actually a predecessor to the Oberlin Heritage Center, so we have a bit of a connection there. So Opus followed many of the tenets of City Beautiful. They maintained these nice tree-lined streets in the town. They made sure that there were large open areas. They really were against fences. And they made sure that downtown had nice storefronts, and that behind these stores, the alleys were also kept clean. And they made plantings throughout the town, and in particular around the railroad depot, since this was the first place that people were getting their first impression of Oberlin. So they wanted to make sure it was a good impression. In addition to these different aesthetic differences they made to the town, Opus was focused on educating the citizens of Oberlin. So for school children, Opus would supply seeds to the children in the springtime, and then the children could raise their own gardens over the summer. And at the end of the season, there would be a judging contest, and they could have a winner for the best garden. And the idea behind this was that, particularly in urban areas, children were losing touch with the land. They weren't farming the land anymore, and so how can you maintain this connection with nature? And one of the ways that this was thought to do this was to have them plant their own little gardens. Opus also made sure to educate the adults in town. And they really had an idea of how the homeowner was supposed to maintain their yard to a certain standard. And so they would hold these community cleanup days, and they would encourage Mayor Doolittle to publish these proclamations in the newspaper, like you can see here, encouraging citizens to eradicate certain weeds from their yards, or maintain their trees at a certain height so that they weren't hanging over the sidewalk and things of that nature. The main way that the group enforced these different ideals they had for the town was largely through peer surveillance. Opus even had different street chairmen who would monitor certain areas of town and report back to Opus if a certain yard didn't meet the standards of what Opus wanted. So I like to include this quote here, which states, "We have often thought that the name of Oberlin should be changed to Oberlin the Beautiful, for such she really is, and such she will continue to be, as long as her people continue to exhibit the pride which they now exhibit in their property." So I love this quote from the 1909 souvenir of Oberlin, because it really demonstrates how the burden of the City Beautiful movement was largely placed on the shoulders of the individual homeowner. And they had to fit into this certain mold that Opus wanted for their yards to look beautiful in order to make the entire town look beautiful. So this was what Opus was about, but they definitely faced issues. And one of their biggest issues in 1910 was Plum Creek. So one of the tenets of City Beautiful was to eradicate disease or limit disease and the spread of it in these overcrowded areas and improve sanitary conditions. So one of the ways to do this was to add sewage systems, modern sewage systems to towns. So by 1910, Oberlin had a sewage system that was not complete yet, but it also seemed to have issues. And the primary issue was that it leaked into Plum Creek. And so this sewage leak upset a lot of the farmers, both in Oberlin and in surrounding towns, because they had livestock who drank from the creek. And then the produce from that livestock was poisoned because Plum Creek was poisoned. And this caused these farmers to file multiple lawsuits against the town of Oberlin over this issue. And in addition to this, this was just a horrible thing for Opus as an organization that wanted to have a beautiful town. And if one of the first things you're seeing when you enter town is a very, very stinky creek, there were even people saying that with the drought of that summer in 1910, the smell was so horrendous. So if that's one of the first things you're seeing about a town, your impression is not going to be very good. That smell is going to linger with you. In addition to this smell and this aesthetic aspect of Plum Creek, you also had a place that was a harbinger for diseases and the spread of diseases. And there was one person in particular who was a part of Opus, and her name was Frances Jewett. You'll recognize her and her husband from the Jewett House here at the Oberlin Heritage Center. So Frances Jewett was very passionate about hygiene, and in particular, she was concerned about black flies and how they spread typhoid. So in 1910, Frances and her husband Frank held a moving picture lecture at the Methodist Episcopal Church. And this was in June of 1910, and they had 675 people attend this, which in a town of 4,300 people, that's a pretty good turnout. So during this lecture, the Jewetts presented a film that showed how flies actually spread this disease, because germs weren't necessarily understood by everyone at this point. And so they showed how flies could land on human waste and then land on your food, or land on the lips of your children, and then spread this typhoid and other diseases and germs. And this seemed to have an effect on people. There were obviously, maybe there was improved sewage systems, or maybe people just were being cleanlier, but in 1909, there were 37 cases of typhoid, and in 1910, there were 17. So the Jewetts' educational push could have had an effect on how Oberlinians were thinking about their cleanliness and their health. So there were a lot of really great aspects to the City Beautiful movement and progressive era ideals in particular. And this, however, was also countered with a lot of not so great aspects of the progressive era. And one of the main things is that there was this idea among progressive followers that cleanliness was equated with moral excellence. And so this became a really sinister way to justify prejudices against immigrant groups, residents of color, and really anyone who did not fit this mold of the upstanding, white, and physically abled citizen that a lot of the members of the progressive era movements were. Which leads me then into what were some of the issues of the day in Oberlin and the difficulties that people were facing. So one of the first things that people were facing was a high cost of living. And this is of course interesting because I think every year we're always talking about a high cost of living or increases in costs of necessities. And people in 1910 were also talking about that. It was 110 years ago, but they're still very similar to us in many ways. So one of the things that was a higher cost of living was a scarcity of leather across the world. And this caused the price of shoes to increase by 10 cents. And it was attributed to the fact that leather was being used more often for furniture and in the automobile industry. Another issue was the cost of meat. It was said that the prices were so high that there was a meat boycott in February of 1910. And in Cleveland alone, there were 50,000 people who signed a pledge saying that they would not eat meat for 30 days in protest of these exorbitant prices. As I've mentioned before too, there was a drought this year. So in the summer of 1910, this drought particularly affected corn crops. And however, it seemed that most crops like wheat, oats, and even peaches were not really affected too horrendously by the drought. And these different effects in the pricing of different necessities caused Oberlin College to increase their tuition from $75 to $100 annually. And they also did this because they had had a record year of enrollment. They had 2,000 students enrolled, and so they increased the tuition to reflect that as well. So despite this sort of dismal high cost of living, Oberlin actually had really high employment rates, so that was good news. According to HistoryForge, 78% of Oberlin males over the age of 18 were employed. And for females over age 18, 34% of them were employed. And some of the major employers at this time were, of course, Oberlin College, the Oberlin Milling Company, and the Oberlin Concrete and Coal Company, among many others. So another big issue of the day was divorce, or at least it seemed like it was a big issue of the day to the people living in this time period. So if you read through the newspapers of this time period, there's this picture that's painted of chaos and this issue in society because of divorce. Yet if you look on HistoryForge, there were only 37 divorcees living in Oberlin in 1910, which makes up less than 1% of the entire population. And then throughout the county, there were 147 divorce cases in 1910 and 5,300 cases in Ohio at this time. Of these lawsuits this year, 80% of them were filed by women, and the major causes for getting a divorce granted were absence and neglect, cruelty, unfaithfulness, drunkenness, and fraud. So I found this interesting because the newspaper articles really spread the news of these divorces in great detail. And it seemed that Oberlinians, while frowning down upon divorces, they had this morbid fascination with them. So one example of that is the cases of the Pyle family and the Severy family. So in June of 1910, Della Severy divorced her husband, Joseph, and she did this on the grounds of cruelty and neglect and claimed that her husband, who was a local grocery man, would overcharge her for food for their children and for the boarders that she maintained, and that overall would just complain frequently about the high cost of maintaining a family. And so the Severys, they got a divorce in the summer of 1910, and Della got alimony and custody of the children. So then we jump forward to September of 1910, and Mary Elizabeth Pyle, who divorced her husband, Harold Pyle. And she divorced him on the grounds of neglect and potentially infidelity. She stated that her husband had used profane language around her and their 15-year-old daughter, and that he had an overall disagreeable nature and wouldn't take her out into society. And in the month leading up to their hearing in court, Harold, actually, who was a physician, stayed in his office and refused to talk to his wife or his daughter in that entire time leading up to the actual trial. And Mary Elizabeth Pyle was able to easily secure her divorce without any disagreement from her husband. So where this gets interesting is when a mere week after Harold and Mary Elizabeth get divorced, Harold remarries to Della Severy. And this causes Joseph Severy to file a lawsuit against Harold in the form of $25,000. And he's claiming that this man ruined his happy household and caused his wife to dislike him and divorce him. So I include this because I find it really interesting that I was fascinated by this information, and I kept trying to find updates about it in the newspapers. And I can just imagine Oberlinians also sort of having this fascination and wanting to follow along with what was happening. It was like their tabloids of the day. But then you have, on the other hand, these people who their personal information and their personal issues are spread across the pages of the newspaper for everyone to read. So I like this quote here, and it's from the article about the lawsuit that Joseph filed against Harold Pyle. And this author states, quote, "The petition makes interesting reading for those who dote on sensational trash of the divorce court variety. And if the suit ever comes to trial, it is said things will be brought up that will furnish all that the morbid can desire." So this really shows how Oberlinians, and I think people in 1910 in general, they didn't like divorce, but they liked reading about divorce. And this was sort of the town gossip that I imagine Oberlinians talking about in this time period. So one final issue that, of course, was affecting Oberlin in 1910 was racism. So as any student of US history will know, by 1910, these laws that were enforced at state and local levels that enforced racial segregation, also known as Jim Crow laws, were affecting all parts of the South and most of the North and even Oberlin. So although Oberlin had been founded on this idea of abolition and equality, Oberlinians were not immune from perpetuating racism in their very own town. So I'd like to include at this point some context of what the racial climate was like in 1910 in the US in general. And a great example of this is found in the Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries fight of the century. So Jack Johnson was a Black boxer from Texas who had great success in his boxing career, had accumulated quite a bit of wealth. And for people who did not like him, they spread these rumors that he coupled with white women. So there was a lot of hate against this successful Black boxer. And this caused people who followed the sport to call for a, quote, white savior to come in, or the great white hope to come in and defeat Johnson once and for all. And so Jim Jeffries came out of retirement in order to fight Johnson. And on July 4th, 1910, the two fought at Reno, Nevada. And you can see a photograph of the fight down here. And you'll notice there are a ton of people in attendance. And it was also said that there were many people waiting at telegraph offices across the country waiting to hear the results of this fight. And after 15 rounds of fighting, Johnson finally defeated Jeffries once and for all. And this caused kind of chaos around the country. So there were a lot of parades in celebration of this. In nearby Columbus, Ohio, there were 400 people who paraded around the town in celebration of Johnson's victory, and the entire time they faced violence. And this caused riots across the nation, and historians estimate that through these riots, 26 people were killed and hundreds more were injured. So you can see how this just one event here with this great tension caused such violence over race issues. And although Oberlin, from what I could find, they didn't ever have any discussion of this fight in papers or things of that nature, race was definitely on the minds of Oberlinians at this time period. So in Oberlin in 1910, there were 793 African Americans living in the town, which was about 18% of the population. And people had sort of differing opinions of what life was like and how good it was for residents of color at this time period. So one gentleman, or could be a woman actually, this is an anonymous author who wrote into the paper, has this quote here, and he says, quote, "There is not now, nor has there been, any race war in Oberlin. The same conditions prevail here today as have existed for years. The Negro has the same privilege in the college he always had. The societies over which the college exercises no control have a right to select their own membership. The colored students have their own societies and live in boarding and rooming houses operated by people of their own color. There seems to be a prevailing idea away from Oberlin that the white and colored people live under the same roof here and intermingle socially without distinction of race or color. In this respect, Oberlin is no different from any other community. No such condition prevails in any section of this country." So you can see with this author here that they don't really think it's a problem that Oberlin is the same as everywhere else in the country. Why should Oberlin be any different? They should also uphold this separate but equal ideal. Residents of color are equal in an educational sphere, but when it comes to specific clubs and social events, separate. And this person seems to think that's perfectly fine, and why should Oberlin be unique? But that was not the opinion of everyone in Oberlin at this time period. And we have here a counter to this in the form of Emma J. Carl, who, according to the census, was a 63-year-old white woman living in Oberlin and working as a dressmaker in 1910. And she wrote into the paper and she disagreed with that other author. And so she states here, quote, "In the beginning, Oberlin stood for the eternal principle of equity for all men. She stood then and has stood for the rights of the oppressed and downtrodden. After passing her 75th anniversary, is she growing so weak that she cannot stand, as she did in her infancy, against the strong tide of outside opinion? Shall the callow undergraduates yield to public opinion and bar the colored race from all the blessings the labors of the Father have won for him?" So we can see here in Emma's article that she wrote in her opinion, she doesn't think it's a good thing that Oberlin is like the rest of the country and just following what everyone else does. She thinks that Oberlin needs to maintain its distinctive difference to what everyone else is doing and maintain these early principles of equity and equality for all people living in the town. And not everyone was content with this separate but equal ideal being upheld and other discriminatory practices being upheld in a place like Oberlin. So beyond just these personal and conflicting beliefs among residents of Oberlin, we also have the effects of institutional racism and infiltrating Oberlin, and in particular in the form of redlining. So here we go. Real estate agencies and banks of this time period had a lot of control over where people were actually allowed to live. And we see an example of this in Oberlin in the form of a real estate agent by the name of Louis Bergner. So Bergner ran one of the 8 real estate offices in Oberlin in 1910. And the reason that we know more about him is because he actually wrote to Oberlin College president Henry Churchill King in 1913, inquiring whether or not he had the right to sell land in predominantly white neighborhoods to residents of color, even if these Black residents were, quote, respectable. And through this course of communication, Bergner comes to the conclusion that he doesn't have the right to do this, and he won't sell land in a predominantly white neighborhood to residents of color, even though those residents of color have all of the means in order to purchase that land. And so these effects of redlining definitely impacted the way that Oberlin looks even today. And HistoryForge is a really cool tool because we can start to visualize the effects of issues like redlining in Oberlin. So if you are interested in learning more about racism in more depth in Oberlin in the 19th and early 20th century, I definitely recommend picking up Elusive Utopia by Carol Lasser and Gary Kornblith. And they do a great job of getting into more of the nuance and context of racism and how it affected Oberlin in a way that you would never imagine if you learn the history of Oberlin's founding. So very generally, that is Oberlin in 1910. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance and issues that I could have gone into, but I hope that through this brief discussion here tonight, you have a better sense of a three-dimensional understanding of Oberlin in 1910. And when you see these people on HistoryForge now, you can understand a little bit of what their day-to-day life was actually like. So now I'll jump into how to use HistoryForge. So if you wanted to check out HistoryForge on your own, you can visit the website. You'll see a link to the website is in the bottom left corner, and you can also find a link to it on the Oberlin Heritage Center website. And when you visit HistoryForge, you'll want to start by clicking along the top of your screen, and I'll actually pull up my pointer here. So along the top of your screen, you'll click on the Forge, and this will bring you to this map that you see here. And you can add the historical map layers that I mentioned previously, the Sanborn maps, and then you'll see all those different dots. If you click on one of the red dots, it'll bring up a box of information you can see here in the bottom right corner that tells you the address of that home and who was living there when. And then if you clicked on one of the names in this household, you would learn even more information that was gathered in the 1910 census about this person. If you're curious about what the yellow bubbles are, that just means that it's large groupings of red dots. So if you zoomed in, you'd be able to see those 26 red dots in more detail. So that's one way to play with HistoryForge. You can click on the different dots. You can even, there's a search for a name or address if you're looking for a particular person or trying to find out maybe who lived in your home in 1910. But let's say you wanted to use HistoryForge to make visuals. So in order to do that, you'll go back up to the top and you'll click on Data, and then you'll choose 1910 US Census. And then once you get to that, you'll see all of the data listed out from the 1910 census that our volunteers have put into HistoryForge for us. And then you'll want to click on the Filter tab. And this will allow you to see particular information. So we're going to start with Civil War veterans. And you'll be shocked to find out that there were no Confederate veterans living in Oberlin in 1910. So you'll click on Union Army and Union Navy, and then you'll hit Submit. And then once you do this, you'll go back up here and you'll click Map It. And when you click Map It, it will now take you back to the Forge page, and you'll see where those Civil War veterans were living in Oberlin in 1910. So there were 37 veterans, and this is where they were living. If you click on one of the red dots, you can see there it pulls up information about their address, and you can learn more about that person. So for Civil War veterans, there's not a lot of interesting information we can get from where they were living. It's not like they all lived together in one section of town. So let's try a different filter that will give us some more interesting information. So in order to start this, make sure that you have deleted the filter that you've already entered. So when you go back to the data tab in 1910, you'll see that this filter is still active. So click on this X button and get rid of that. One way to confirm that you've gotten rid of it is in the bottom left of your screen, you'll be able to see how many records are visible. So in this case, we have 4,364 records in total for 1910. So I know that that filter was successfully deleted because all the records are visible. If it still just said found 37 records, then that filter had not been deleted. So this time we're going to filter again, and we're going to filter this time for race. So in 1910, these were the options down here for how people could identify for race. And the terms Black and mulatto were used interchangeably for African-American residents. So I'm clicking on both of those, and then I hit submit. And I get that there are 793 African-American residents, and here's where they were living. So this is interesting, but I want to learn even more. I want to know how many African-American residents owned property or rented property. And so what I'm getting here with this information is I'm potentially getting servants of color who were living with their employers, or I'm getting college students who were living with boarders. They were boarders in personal private homes. And one thing I do want to point out real quick here is that the 1910 census did not collect all of the college students. So the information you're seeing is omitting many of the college students, but you might find some of them that were living in particular dorms or boarding houses included in the data. So to learn more, I want to add a second filter. So I'm going back to the 1910 data tab, and then I click on filter again, and this time I'm going to filter and I'm going to choose relation to head, and I want to type in head. So I want to find out who were the heads of household, because those were the people responsible for paying rent or for the mortgage. So I enter this in, I hit submit, and then I hit map it. And now you can see the difference between the two maps that I have here. So this one on the left here is still the 793 residents. And now we see which ones were actually the heads of the household, and there's only 231 residents. And you'll notice that a lot of the red dots in this western part of town have disappeared, and in this new allotment up here, that big 12 bubble is now gone. And we still have a lot of red dots to the north and the southeast. So this is really interesting. And now I want to see another filter. I want to see how many of these heads of household owned land, owned their property versus rented it. So I go back to the data tab, I enter in that this person owns their property. So now I have 231 African-American heads of household, and of those, 120 of them owned property. And you'll notice that this has taken out most of the red dots in the center and to the west. And even many of the red dots that you'll see in these areas. But the southeast part of town has maintained quite a few residents. Down here on Lincoln Street and to the north, there are still a lot of African-American heads of house who own property. So this is just one, or actually two examples of ways that you can use HistoryForge and filters on HistoryForge to, for your research purposes or for fun visuals and interesting different things you can find out through the software. So these are some examples of other filters that we've tested out and have found to be interesting. In particular, I like the immigrant groups filter. You can see if different immigrant groups banded together and lived in certain parts of town, or if they sort of dispersed throughout the town. And these are some of the major groups of immigrants in Oberlin in 1910, and there are obviously more as well. Okay, so next steps for HistoryForge. As I've mentioned, we are already into the 1940 census and already 2/3 of the way through that. And the reason for this big jump in the time frame from 1910 to 1940 is to be able to see large change over time, and in particular things like I was just showing you with the effects of redlining. So once we've completed 1940, our hope is to jump further back in time and again have a large example of change over time and go back into the 19th century and see how the town changed. And then over time, gradually add in the census years that we've skipped over. Of course, assuming that our volunteers want to continue. So hopefully I have piqued your interest tonight about HistoryForge, and you'll want to go and test this new tool out on your own. If you're ever interested in volunteering with HistoryForge, we are always open to welcoming new volunteers. If you visit the HistoryForge website, there is a Google form on there that you can simply fill out, and it'll give us your information so we can contact you. Right now, we are taking a bit of a break in the transition period while I'm gone, and we won't be having group sessions until October. But if you are interested, we'll keep you in mind for October, reach out to you, and we're happy to train you during these group sessions. You're also welcome to, if you run into any issues throughout your time playing around with HistoryForge or have any other questions beyond tonight, feel free to contact our director, Liz, and she can help you with some of those issues. So thank you again for tuning in tonight, and thank you to all of our volunteers who have made this project possible. So I'll now open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you, Marissa. So yes, you're welcome to put your questions into the chat box. Otherwise, you can also turn on your audio, turn on your video, and ask live.
Marissa, this is Liz. I did get a comment that came to me. If I could ask, Rob Thompson, are you still on?
Yes, I'm on.
Are you comfortable sharing what you shared with me? I think that is very relevant to the whole program.
Sure. A while back, I did a history of Hollywood Street, where I'm a resident. That street opened up in 1909. And the lots for sale were not for sale to blacks. And even though those people that bought the lots could not sell them to blacks, according to the deed. So that matches with what you were saying, Marissa.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Put in a plug for your book as well.
Yeah, my book is available at the library or at the OHC. And Liz, I have more copies, so I might give you some to sell.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is Rob again. So how do you get into the HistoryForge, or what is there a website to get onto, or how do you do
Yeah, so there's a website. You can find it on the Oberlin Heritage Center website. I can give you, I can actually pop it into the chat here real quick.
I just dumped it in, Marissa.
Perfect. So you can check out that link and play around with the different features of HistoryForge on your own.
Thanks.
Bill Hilton.
Yeah, my name is Bill Hilton. I'm in Sunnyvale, California, and I really enjoyed this, partly because I'm working on a photo tour of my hometown, Sunnyvale. And this might have some particular application for us. But what I wanted to know was, what would one have to do to get started with HistoryForge? Will it cost some money? I saw something about a grant at the beginning. Is the data in effect already there, or would the data have to be added by myself or somebody else? How do we get going?
So this is probably more of a question for our partners in Ithaca. HistoryForge is funded through a grant, and we don't have, since it's grant funded, we don't have to pay anything to use HistoryForge. And the data does have to be input by volunteers. So we use Family Search for the census sheets, and then you have to go through, read the lines, and type them into HistoryForge and all that information in. So the data would not just be there. It would be a group project or a long project for a single person to enter all that information in order to get the type of visuals that I was showing tonight.
Okay, Sounds like a project. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
Can I add, one of the partners that we work with in Ithaca is on the program here tonight. Bill, can you send us an email and we can get you in touch with Eve Snyder? Because we can connect you to at least talk about the basics of the program.
I'll be happy to send you an email. Thank you.
Right. Marissa, I had a question come in to me. She was wondering if you could explain the map layers, how Sanborn you can like change what the two maps are and how you can adjust those.
Yeah, so the way that the Sanborn map layers work is they're rectified by us on the back end. And then when you visit HistoryForge and you're in the Forge, which is the map section, there are two options right now for Oberlin's HistoryForge, and you can click on the check mark next to it, and that will overlay the historical map layer on top of the present day map that we have of Oberlin. And so that way you can adjust the transparency of it. So if you wanted to be able to see some of the historical maps, some of the current day map, and see how they line up, and where certain things were in 1910 that weren't there, that aren't there now. Does that answer the question, Liz?
I'm not sure. Ann Fuller, if you want to chime in.
Yes, it answered it.
Great. It looks like I have, okay. So there's a question from Linda. It says, might you jump to 1970 and 2000 censuses? So we'd love to, but unfortunately the way that the censuses work, the information is not released until, is it 70 years after the census is completed? So we are actually looking at the 1950 census becoming available next year. So that would be the most current date that we could potentially add to HistoryForge. So right now with 1940, that is the most current date that we have available to us.
72 years.
72 years. Thank you.
If anybody's looking to figure out who was living in their home in 1970, the Oberlin Heritage Center does have some records, directories of the city, as well as a historic building inventory that can be researched with an appointment. Any final questions? Oh, sorry, Ann.
Yeah, why don't you explain how you check the data with these city directories and things? I mean, it's pretty neat how, you brought these other sources together when you were working on the census to check various things.
Yeah, great. So that was Ann speaking, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Ann. So Ann is one of our volunteers. And so what we have with HistoryForge for volunteers, there's a transcribers corner. And we've uploaded different resources. So if you want to cross-reference, like there are particular enumerators with not so great handwriting, and maybe you can't read what that person's last name is, or you think it's spelled wrong, or some other information that you might be able to find, we have the 1910 Oberlin City Directory uploaded to HistoryForge. So our volunteers are able to search that and find if that person's name is spelled a certain way or other information they may be looking for, or where they lived, their street address. We also have reference materials in relation to what the street names were at this time period, if they had a west or east distinction, or north or south, and different ways for volunteers to be able to double check the census information that's sometimes difficult to decipher.
Samantha Hudson has her hand raised. Feel free to chime in.
Hi, so I'm calling in from Houston today if you guys are trying to keep track of where you're reaching people from. But I was wondering if there were any questions, Marissa, that you had while you were going through this data that maybe were going to be too big of a project for the time that you had left, but that might be interesting for the Historical Society to look at in the future.
Very big question. Yeah, I think that for me, there was a lot of information that I wanted to learn more about, but my time was definitely limited. So I had to focus on a few of the issues of the day. And so One of the things that I'd be really interested in seeing going forward is for HistoryForge in particular, more pairing of visuals with the data that we have on HistoryForge so far. I think it's really interesting to see what the houses or what people looked like that lived there in that time period. I think another thing in terms of research, I wanted to get more into what were some of the things that people would do in town at that time period. So like finding, I believe the book is called Bonnets to Boardrooms. There's a lot of oral history information added in. I didn't get a lot into the oral histories from the people from this time period. And there's discussion of things like the Gators family skating rink and just some activities that people would do from day to day for fun. And also delving more into the school district and how schooling was at this time period and the college.
Yeah, it would definitely be cool to learn more about those topics. Thank you.
Marissa, and I apologize, I'm not sure if these messages are going to you and Amanda as well. Another question was, what other sources do you plan on adding besides the federal census? And I know you touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, so something that we're hopefully going to start expanding on, have begun a little bit, and also that the feature is being developed in HistoryForge, is adding visuals and pairing pictures that we have in the Oberlin Heritage Center collection with particular residences or people that we have from the census information. And that way you'd be able to see even more when you're figuring out where people lived and learning about different people. You'd have that visual component paired with it.
And this was another comment. Sorry, Bill, I jumped in. And
Oh, go ahead.
shared that Anna, volunteer, said one feature that was interesting in the 1910 census was the presence of missionary children and where they were born.
Sorry, what was the question again?
Oh, there wasn't really a question. That was just interesting that came up. We all loved the little side stories when doing data entry.
Yes. Yeah, and I see here Eve has a question about for me or for any volunteers that would like to chime in, if there's anything that was particularly interesting that we learned or surprised me or found to be of interest. And I would say for me, I was most surprised by the number of people living in a household and the number of women who were the head of household, and a lot of households that had widows, multiple widows living together in their old age. And I thought that was really interesting. I think another thing, unless one of our volunteers wants to chime in, that we were starting to notice, someone pointed out, is you can track infant mortality rates through the 1910 census, and the infant mortality rates for African-American women vastly differ from white women in town at the time period.
Marissa, the kind of history that this has presented is very different from what I studied at Oberlin College in the Dark Ages. And I'm wondering whether this kind of sort of, well, I don't know what to call it, but domestic history is what you're going to focus on as you go on for more schooling?
Yeah, I really love local history. That's definitely my favorite area to be in. During my time at the Cole site, I was able to research in depth the family of Thomas Cole and what their lives were like after they lost their breadwinner and how they dealt with this property. And so I do really like the personal touches and getting to know people in the past. And I hope to continue that in whatever museums I work in the future.